Sales Mistake. This is the show where we dive into not only the success stories behind the leading voices in sales and marketing, but also the mistakes they made along the way, what they learned from them, and how it helped them get to where they are today. Today, we have a guest with a unique background, Nate Nasralla. His experience spans a wide range that includes nonprofits, consulting, IP valuation, enterprise sales, helping startups, and now co-founder. And while that's awesome, what I really appreciate is Nate's perspective on complex enterprise buying and selling. His guidance on how to build effective narratives and business cases that can drive consensus and ultimately get a CFO's green light are absolute gold. In fact, I think his tagline says it all. I'll teach you to sell with buyers, not to them. Nate, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to it.
Awesome, awesome. Me too. And did I pronounce your last name right? I forgot to ask you in our pre-show. Did I get it? Did I get the
No,
pronunciation
you
correct?
you you nailed it. Yep, you got it.
Nice, because that's always a great way to start off a show is getting the the guest name wrong. So what I found really interesting when I kind of dug into your background was, there's a clear theme of nonprofit, of helping, of looking to kind of make the world a better place. My interpretation. So if I'm off there, feel free. But I'm kind of curious, like how you started in that space, and then how that led into maybe sales, because I think a lot of folks and it could well be a misconception, don't necessarily connect nonprofit and sales together.
hmm Well, so my very first job, I'll call it that, was working with a nonprofit that I experienced firsthand as a student. And basically, we would take student groups on out into different missions projects because it was a great vehicle to put them in uncomfortable situations where we could teach them leadership principles. And so I did that for a little while and started to kind of get interested in early stage companies, kind of startup building. I've always had a bit of, some entrepreneur's blood running through me. So I joined an early stage company that was, it's called Tiesta Tea, where we basically were the vitamin water of loose leaf tea, branded for kind of a younger, health conscious consumer. Pretty cool company. So I built the first sales program there and was like, this is fun, but like tea's not really my thing. Like I like the company building part of it, but there's got to be something else. So that was the detour into consulting. And that's where I started building kind of valuation models, working with different tech companies in order to figure out, basically put a number on different types of technology, like a motion controller for a video game, right?
Mhm.
And I remember working on one of the largest technology bankruptcy proceedings in history. And it was basically like a $10 billion slice of pie that different consultants were charged with figuring out, okay, who contributed what IP to create this basically estate after the company went bankrupt, and who gets what. So there were pensioners, there were all sorts of people who were claiming a part of that, right? And I remember, I this was over a decade ago now, um, and I was still pretty early in my career, and I remember getting this basically like a black card, where it was unlimited expenses. I could go out to eat anywhere, every meal, like unlimited, because every single person wanted to spend as much money as they could on professional services, the best talent, lawyers, so on, so that they could get the biggest chunk of their pie. And there was this weird kind of incentive thing where it was like, we're spending down this estate as, the professional service providers so that the people within that we represent could grab more from others. And it just gave me this really weird kind of gross feeling of like, this isn't what I want to do. you know like I missed some of the nonprofit roots.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed the time like building in a early stage company. And that's where, when I left that consulting firm and I met who became my co-founder for the first company I co-founded,
Mhm.
we built fundraising software for nonprofits to help them raise money to go do what they do. And there's about 1.2 million nonprofits in the US. They raise about $430 billion, B, with a B, not million, $1 billion per
Mhm.
year. So most people don't really realize, like, wow, a lot of a lot of the US runs on social services. It is a massive marketplace with a large set of unmet needs. Great place to go build a business. So I did that, and now giving you kind of the full story, full backstory. That was how I kind of landed on this idea of like, man, it is so important for me to love the things that I do because that's what brings me life and energy during the day. Um, and I truly believe a lot of people can spend their life searching for their life's work. And I happened to be very lucky to get on this track where I had found it early on in life. Now, final kind of detour that I'll take you on to kind of start to
Hmm.
connect some of the dots.
Yeah.
So after that first company was acquired, I started building up the first strategic sales team inside of the new company that bought us. Left that after doing that for a couple years and built another enterprise sales team selling into Fortune 500s. And what I thought was just like this like thing that happened in the nonprofit world where big buying decisions happen at a board meeting. And so you are literally never in the room when a buying decision is being made. And then I start working and selling and building teams in other industries and selling to Fortune 500s. And I'm like, oh, this is, exact same story. It's always our champions who are in the room who are selling. And so I kind of learned a lot of the things that I now teach. I'm building our current company, Fluent, around
Hmm.
just kind of by going through, I never went through a sales training program.
Hmm.
I had heard about the concept of Challenger, for
Hmm.
example.
Hmm.
I knew of it, but had never been through a training program. Never really went through the traditional sales kind of grooming process, if you will, SDR to AE to senior to enterprise and so on. And so I just kind of had to figure it out in a way. And it was very helpful because kind of along the way and all of the mistakes that I made in order to forge my own learning just made everything that much stickier when I learned to kind of arrive at them, either through a lot of nerves, anxiety, and failures, or just kind of figuring it out and kind of first principles thinking.
Oh man, that is such a great picture that you just painted, and it really helps bring it full circle for me. I think what's interesting, I want to put a pin in this because I want to keep kind of going down the path of the boardroom because I think that's a spot that a lot of sellers don't have the chance to see because it's just not a natural place that you get to be if you've started out in the traditional path. Before I forget, I do want to come back to the idea that I think, even though that consulting and IP valuation wasn't your cup of tea, I would
Mm-hmm.
wager there were a few skills that you took out of there. And so it's important for folks to remember that,
Mm-hmm.
along the way, even if we're not in the perfect situation, there are certainly some hard skills we can take out of each opportunity we have.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Well, maybe I'll kind of spend a quick word on that because that was literally the blog post that I posted this morning. And so that's probably maybe why I kind of took you down the long path of the backstory and the career history there. And it was all about how this process of doing case interviews for the consulting world trained the way I think about structuring and clarifying a narrative for executives. Currently, what we basically do at Fluent is we help sellers write business cases so that their champions can sell with a clear message when they're not there in the room. And hours and hours and hours spent training myself on how to think and process information in a very structured way is essentially that's the job in consulting. And so that post that I just put out there is the connection between all of those principles that I learned during that chapter of my career and now how it's showing up over a decade later in the work that I'm doing and then the teams that I built along the way.
And for folks who are connected live, we'll go ahead and post this underneath the live post, and then we'll also include a link to it in the show notes afterwards for folks who are catching up on this later. So let's talk a little bit about kind of that boardroom narrative. Like, kind of what were some of your first experiences early on that you realized this is a bit harder than maybe I thought it was going to be, or maybe you thought the boardroom was somewhere you might have had a chance to present, but you learned quickly that that was not the case. What were some of the kind of the lessons you learned early on there?
Yeah, so I would say the first place that I started to go deep into this was when our that first company that I told you about in the nonprofit space was acquired, and I wanted to go kind of build up this strategic team. And our CEO at the time was mostly focused on the backstory of that company. Grew up in the payments business, largest payments processor, for online donations. You walk into a Patagonia, or you use your American Express, or you're on Facebook and you make a donation. All of the payments technology is that company.
Hmm.
And they were spinning off a line of software to go sell to all of the companies that they were running, basically payroll, if you will, or payments for. And that was kind of the main focus. And then here I was on the side saying, like, oh, there's so many other market segments that we could go tackle, highly complex deals. Let's go do this. And I had to make a case to say, hey, this is why we should invest in building up this team. Even though we have this whole other division that we're standing up inside of the company, let's do another one, basically.
Hmm.
And the question was, when he was going to go walk into our own company's boardroom and pitch and say, hey, we're gonna go this route as well. This is why it makes sense. At first, my messaging to our CEO was all about the larger deals that we could be doing, and it totally missed the broader strategic narrative of share, landscape, competitive positioning, things that were coming up in the boardroom. And I didn't understand that at first. And when I went back to try to write down and clarify, okay, here is the link between the things that you're talking about from a market strategy perspective, how this intersects and relates to this new division within the company. Say these things during the board meeting. First, writing it out helped me clarify it. And then, second, over time, I began to realize, like, wait, if this is how a big decision inside of our own company gets made, isn't this what is going on for all of our customers that we're going to be selling to as well? It's not in the sales meeting where we're talking about, you're talking, especially with a champion, like they're on board, they love it. That's why they are a champion.
Yeah.
They'll have access, they'll go to and be prepping the message for that board meeting, but you're not going to be there. And that's where the decision is being made. And so we have to kind of bridge those two approaches into one. And so that was the very first moment where I kind of had this like, okay, I see now. I see where we have to shift the way that we sell.
And it's almost like by making the focus of your initiative maybe too small, too narrow,
Mm-hmm.
you miss the opportunity to really connect it to the broader strategy of the company.
That's right. That's right. And if you want to kind of go deeper on this, another really practical way and a website that I love, I found this earlier this year, and man, I got sucked deep down the rabbit hole, is techemails.com. And
Okay.
they basically scan different litigation during discovery. Any type of litigation process, there is document discovery where those are shared at a point. If those proceedings are made public, then I mean, thousands and thousands and thousands of documents on these public companies are released out into the wild. And so this site looks for the most interesting ones and will post them.
Hmm.
And so the one that was posted earlier this week was Tim Cook's board notes walking into, I think it was a late 2018 board meeting. And you see him making notes on all of the topics and the points that he wants to hit and highlight with his board. And so the question is, so, if you're interested or you're working with larger enterprises, go check that out. We can also, I can grab a link and share it.
Yes.
And then just say, are the things that I'm sending back to my champion to help them with their internal messaging, does it in any way relate to the topics that I'm seeing in board notes for executives of larger companies? If not, then one of two things. One, that's fine because you're doing more transactional, small scale deals. It's specific to a particular functional group and it's not company wide. That's fine. You can get a deal done without having to speak at a board level and
Hmm.
prepare that type of executive level narrative. Or the second is you want to be doing the larger transformational deals and you're not speaking to those types of topics. Well, there's a great opportunity to improve and go deeper.
Oh, wow. I love that. Yes, we definitely are going to need to pull up that link and share it out with folks. And I think it's actually interesting because I think one of the things that maybe I would tend to disagree with that I see on LinkedIn is when folks have really strict qualification criteria. I think in a fast paced environment 5 years ago where money was cheap, it made a
Mm-hmm.
lot of sense for folks to be like, oh yeah, do you have budget for this or not? I actually, when I hear folks have a set budget for something, I tend to actually uh, become less excited And I'll say why. Because a lot of times the budget that they have set is not at all associated with what likely the outcomes they want to achieve. Um, and
Mm-hmm.
because it's just rare that folks are going to have, quote unquote money lying around and set aside for truly transformational items. And that might be some of my perspective is painted around the fact that we're trying to actually transform behavior across a large organization. But what I think is interesting about what you're sharing is when there's not budget assigned, it doesn't mean that there's not money inside the company. There's definitely money to invest. It's just
Yeah.
where are they going to invest it, and how are they going to be convinced where the correct place to invest it is?
Yeah. And I think the way that I would summarize that is budget is created, not allocated. Money it isn't just like hanging around like, oh yeah, we got some kind of like fun project money over here. Maybe we could pull on that. And when it gets created, it's created because it is aligned or attached to an executive priority. So, speak of kind of stories from my sales career, here's a really recent one. One of the teams that we kicked off work with at Fluent all came up because the sales organization, kind of globally, it was a pretty kind of company wide challenge. They were losing time and time again in competitive deals. And the reason is that when they would go up against some of their larger competitors, all of their messaging was focused on features, functions, and so they weren't enabling champions to sell value and to create a value based message. And they have some kind of big growth goals and expectations from their board for this year. And so, after I had met with the head of every region, a couple executives within the company, I meet their CEO. And we're talking through this, and he says, you know, pretty verbatim, this is the number one most important initiative inside of the company right now. This shift from a very tech focused culture to one of value that would start with how the sales team operated, but then would ripple through account management and implementation and professional services and so on. So it is incredibly important. And when we were talking through the business case that my champions and I had built, and we were kind of reading through it, we get to the point of talking about the investment. Like, here's what it's going to take to do this with all of your sellers. And his point was the largest risk that I see here is that we underinvest. So we need to increase the amount of services time to make sure that this sticks and that we get this right. So we need to spend more. And the budget increased because we had aligned with one of literally the most important thing in the CEO's mind. And that is often the difference of beginning to plan when you're talking about solving a problem for a specific functional team versus you're aligned with a priority at an executive level. Things can change very quickly, and it makes budget not really a legit, call it objection or roadblock, because they'll find a way if it's important enough. And if you've messaged how you can help enable that thing that is very important to them.
I'm sure sellers right now are like, wait a second, they told you they wanted to spend more. And you know what? It's true. It's happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it's great when you have a champion like that and you're able to align to it. The other thing probably folks who are listening are asking themselves is, Nate, I don't always have access to the CEO. How can I help my champion, or in sometimes in the Challenger vernacular, my mobilizer, find out what those initiatives are? Or how can I ask them what those initiatives are? Because
Mm-hmm.
sometimes either I don't know how to ask or they don't know the answer.
So there are a couple different things. One, notice by the way, I didn't say like, yeah, my very first meeting, I walked into the room with the CEO and we had this chat and he, laid everything out, right? That's not at all how it happened. There are a couple things that you can do to your question. So one is when you are walking into those first meetings, depending on the amount of information that's available, things like you, it would it, how do I say this? People just don't go to the stuff that's already out there, number one. So do the basics, things like an earnings call, for example. Actually, one of our customers sent me a link to an earnings call for a company that's called Zscaler.
Mhm.
And in it, they were saying our ability to win right now is based on the sales team's effectiveness of creating CFO ready business cases. if we continue to do this on every deal, we'll stay competitive and we'll continue to win. And so they sent me a screenshot. They were prospecting into that account and they were like, dude, this is like, the work that you do. And I have a call with their team next week, which is, pretty fun.
Nice.
So the point being is like, there is stuff out there that sometimes we just don't even look for. And therefore we can't raise it and ask about it. So that's number one. And if it's, by the way, if it's coming up inside of an earnings call, it's pretty important, right? So it's something that an executive is literally talking to and telling people that they're focused on. Second, another way to think about this is when you're on a discovery call. Let's say you're like, hey, I'm just kind of talking with managers and directors, and I say that because I'm like impersonating a sales rep who's like they don't have a C in front of their title.
Mm-hmm.
And don't discount the amount of intel and knowledge that they know and can share. And so one thing that I love to do is figure out the code name or the internal trigger phrase for a particular deal and just ask and talk to them about that. And so I might say something like, hey, in some of the all hands or all staff conversations that you've been a part of, are there any certain phrases that keep coming up over and over again to describe some of the projects that you guys are focused on right now? And I'll give you an example of this of another deal that we are just about to kick off. Route 66 is the phrase because the sales team is all about driving big deals. So there's this theme of like, driving, going on the customer journey. So Route 66 is the internal project name for this enablement initiative around creating business cases, executive level messaging that now we're attached to. And that's how that deal for us was developed. So, I guess part of it comes to like you don't discover what you don't ask. And that's one way to ask.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I mean, I think it's really interesting because, you hear advice like around some psychological principles, like, to mirror your customer or something like that. And I think a lot of that stuff gets taken out of context because, somebody might be like, oh, well, they, took a sip of water. I'll take a sip of water. It's like, it's not that tactical. What it is much more what Nate's bringing up here is it's about understanding, what are the key things that are happening inside the organization? Why are they happening? And how are they referring to them so they can feel like you are on their team, you're on the same side of the table as them.
That's right. And I mean, if you want to get nerdy for a second, kind of the phrase for this in both evolutionary psychology, but then in any type of communication type of schooling that you look at is coordinating language or language coordination. And the basic idea is that if you think about how over time, we have just advanced as a human race, it's all been about safety. It's been about tribes. It's been about like people groups, people where we are safe. And if you spoke the same dialect, the same language as other people, it signaled in your mind like, okay, I can let my guard down. They're my people. And when you use the same language as somebody else, you're coordinating your language. It's a subtle cue to say, hey, same, right? You're safe here. We can go deeper. We can talk because I get it. I'm part of the same circle. And so it is a very powerful thing beyond just like, using language that sounds nice. There's something that happens that unlocks a lot deeper and more meaningful conversation after you can coordinate language with the prospects that you're working with.
I love that. And then actually, I had just kind of had the thought at the same time, I'm guessing that, in an executive level meeting or in a corporate meeting, it probably also helps you align to how they organize the topic. So it's not, topic 1, 2, 3, topic 3 is talk about this vendor. No, it's topic 3 is talk about, in this case, Route 66. And then the answer is, we have an answer to Route 66. And so you're slotting in much more naturally into the flow of what they're already discussing. Am I way off base there, or am I?
No, you're exactly right. Because when you use a code name or a phrase like that, it also brings up so much rich context around what that project means that you don't have to kind of talk through. It's just a signal of like, hey, everything around it, I get it. We can just move through all of these other topics to like dig right in together. And I will say kind of a related story. One of our other customers pinged me the other day and he was like, Nate, I've heard you talk about like inside of our business cases, using some of these phrases. I was in a meeting with an exec that I was meeting for the first time, and I used this phrase that I had heard my champion use. I didn't like totally understand what it meant or like what the project was about. And turns out it was basically about a RIF or a company-wide layoff project, and they were figuring out who was going to be affected by that. And so the executive was like, "Who told you this? How do you know what this project is?" And because they didn't really understand the significance or the meaning baked into, that a couple words or a simple phrase, they kind of had to recover a little bit and be like, "Oh, I see. That's what that's what that is all about." So, I guess I'll say with the caveat that you do understand the significance or the context that that phrase brings.
So, when another kind of question that I hear, or something that I hear quite a bit when I either engage with frontline sellers, sales assemblies, nice enough to have both of us on as facilitators in some other situations similar to that, is they'll say something to the effect of like, I have a bought-in champion,
Mm-hmm.
but either they don't have access to the data that we need, or they just maybe aren't fully motivated to do all that work. And I think one of the things that I think is really interesting is what I've found is that if you're able to, what we call commercially coaching, or basically be able to provide your champion or mobilizer a vision of what it takes to get this across the line, a lot of times they'll feel supported and they're much more willing to dig in. It's not like you're just sending them off to do busy work. So I'm curious, from your perspective, like what do you find to be an effective conversation when you feel like somebody's bought in, and what's the role of the seller to start to kind of guide them down this path of like, hey, you need to start thinking this is not just going to your boss and asking for money. We need to set this up with a little bit more so we set you up for success.
Yeah, so there are a couple of different things that I think about. One is the fact in highly complex deals, you will need multiple different types of champions from different teams around the company. And so one mistake that I've learned the hard way is by realizing like, wow, a lot of our champions inside of the deals that close the fastest and most successfully, they didn't even know each other before the deal because they're coming from such different teams. And so we've gotten into trouble by thinking that okay, we have one like awesome champion that's enough to get a deal done. It's definitely not. Um, Especially if you're working in, for example, a highly technical organization, you may need a technical champion, a business champion. You may need a finance champion, and those people may not have worked on a project together.
Mm-hmm.
And so, one role of the seller as a champion enabler is to help curate and help them think about who are the right people to involve and to bring into the deal. Number one. Number two, I love the word that you used around a vision. Give them a vision for what could be after working together. And that's in two parts. One, they need to be thinking about things like if we were to write up a press release because we fully launched this, what would be so exciting that we want to talk about internally? Okay, that's what I need to say to get support and buy-in from other teams who they all have day jobs. They don't really love the idea that they're being asked for time to work on rolling out a new project. So how do we motivate them on the big thoughts around why this change is important? And then you can go in and start to fill in some of the tactics around, okay, how do we do this? This is probably where a lot of sellers are thinking about mutual action planning and some of the steps and logistics at this point. And another kind of mistake to your point is like if a champion isn't following through on something, they may not get like what why does this need to happen in this order at this point? I'm still stuck back on some of the higher level questions of like how do I message this to get other people supported? And so it's a pretty common mistake, actually. That when we first started introducing mutual action plans as well, I was like, from call one, let's layer these in. And it was like, oh, yeah, this, talking about the how before the why, it just doesn't make sense, to a buyer. And it's not a kind of a fair signal to say they are or are not actually a champion and engaged. And then kind of the very last piece, when it is time, it's like, okay, we have the support. Now let's talk about how we make this happen. Um, the question that a lot of people will be encouraged to ask is like ask them for the buying process, the decision process. Hey, how have you bought similar things like this in the past? Fine question. I get why people are trained to ask it. Far better is to show a series of steps and say, hey, this is how we've seen people buy and roll out a project like this in the past, what doesn't fit? What seems off? By the way, anything missing, it is far easier and far more productive for a champion to kind of react to that. Another, piece that I just kind of picked up by trial and error of like having a lot of people stare at me blankly and then like, I don't know, we go through the procurement, we send you the paperwork, you sign the paperwork, and then we do it,
Yeah, and I think it's really important because to your point, like it is a first pressure test of where we're at with our champion. Because I don't know how familiar you are with kind of Matt Dixon's latest research, the Jolt effect, but I think it's really interesting stuff when it comes to this complex environment, your mid cycle. So first off, you have to defeat status quo. They have to recognize there's a problem and a reason to change. If they're not willing to start to talk to you about the things that you need to do, then you may not have defeated status quo, and you need to start to go back and rethink whether they're even motivated to change at all.
Mm-hmm.
What's really interesting is, what the Jolt effect really talks about is even though you may have defeated status quo, you still have to get it over the line, which is, I think, what's really interesting about what you're mentioning is you've got multiple stakeholders
Mm-hmm.
from different functions. They have different KPIs and metrics to hit. So what is it that we can get them all to coalesce around, your Route
Mm-hmm.
66s of the world, that are really those strategic pieces, and how do you suss them out, and then how do you connect those to essentially the different pieces that each of those stakeholders are working on. So I'd be curious, like, what do you think some of the key elements are to a good narrative and a good business case are? Because I would imagine they likely address some of the customer and decision pieces of, like, why they oftentimes don't move forward. So I'd be curious to kind of get your perspective on what some of the elements of those are.
Yeah, so think of them as kind of like building blocks that stack up on top of each other. Usually there is some type of situational context or executive priority, like what is happening, what change is going on inside of the organization that makes now in kind of an interesting time to even have this conversation. Then what you can do is you can go down to layer in a problem statement that is very specific in how it both measures and then frames up the problem. The way that you frame the problem can vary the way somebody perceives the right approach to solving that. So, sharp problem statement followed by the approach. The approach isn't just a product. It's like,
Mm.
hey, buy this software or the solution. It's like, of all of the different drivers that impact a particular metric, especially as you're selling higher level to executives, there are a lot of different alternative paths that we could take. Why is this the right one? And then you can use some of your unique differentiators to frame up decision criteria to say, because everybody's aligned on this approach, with us, and then what is unlocked by way of payoff once they take that approach, they partner with you. And think about it as just kind of like flipping the problem upside down. You're creating contrast between what is today, what could be tomorrow, using those same metrics and framing to say this is what happens after. And then finally, what's required. If we agree we want to solve this problem now with this approach to get this payoff, what do we do? And this is where a lot of people just talk about the finances. They're not thinking about the effort of time, people, teams, energy that needs to go in over a certain period of time. And sometimes there can be, certain scenarios for like, hey, we could do it at this scale or at this scale. If we do it at this scale, this is what your outcomes look like. If we do it only at this scale, this is what your outcomes look like here. So packaged all together, that is a narrative. As long as it relates to or attaches to some of the existing storylines that are already circulating inside of the account, that's when it becomes an internal narrative, not just like something that you as the seller invented. It's an internal narrative, which is what you need to build specifically because it relates to what is already happening inside of the buying team, and it's going to travel around because, again, that it's going to resonate. So that's how I would define it.
I love that. And I think, just to put a little bit of an emphasis on it, one is problem statement. Having a good, well-defined problem statement that people can react to is incredibly important. One of the biggest influences on my career has definitely been Jen Allen. Everybody knows this. And what Jen talks about is, being able to have a group meeting on the problem before you even start to talk about the solution so that we can get alignment on the problem, because folks may have different ideas of how big the problem is or what the causes of the problem are. If you can't get alignment there, good luck trying to get people on trying to align on how to solve for it. And I think what's really interesting is the second piece to that is like that you really said, you know, the approach to solving it is not your product. It's a larger solution. You might be part of that solution, but it's important not to get blinders and just go, well, so if you buy A, then B is solved. Because like
Right.
especially CC executives know things are far more complicated than that. And you're just gonna like reduce your credibility if you overpromise what a single solution is. And I think it's one of the real positives that I found is like when you can engage with folks, your champions, mobilizers, and recognize that they have multiple options to solve a problem. It's not just picking you or your one or two competitors. There's buy
Right.
versus build. There's solve it internally. There's some other mix. There's alternative approaches. Being honest with them and saying like, hey, what are some of the other things you're considering to solving this? What are some of your other options? And I'm happy to kind of talk through the pros and cons. Can really help kind of go from vendor, buyer to same side of the table. Let's solve this problem together.
Yeah, that's right. And a time when I didn't do that well, actually because I underestimated our champion in the deal. We were selling to a large insurance company, and I had a new hire who I had made within like the last 2 weeks on the call with me, and there was a little bit of like me trying to like show off so that this new hire thinks his boss is a smart guy that was going on, and that like ego was blinding. And I forgot to realize kind of where we were within the conversation. And the champion had already done the internal conversations with their SVP around this is why we're going to go down this path. Better than alternatives, better than competitive platforms. So, let's have a conversation. You can kind of see and double check, but otherwise, this is the route. Great. So that's the context that they showed up to the conversation with. In my mind, I was going to jump in and give the world's greatest product demo, talk all about why this is the right path, right? And so I forget exactly how long. I was like maybe 5 minutes into my spiel or something like that. And then he just stops me and he's like, Nate, like I'm already sold. Let's just talk about what comes next. And he was almost like, who is this guy and why is he saying all of these things to me, right? I've already talked with our team, and like I remember texting our champion afterward and being like, I'm so sorry. And we got the deal done, and it was went on to be actually a great customer for us. But point was, I was like, wow, yeah, um, went way too deep on product, totally missed where we were at in the conversation. Um, but I will tell you that didn't happen again after that one, especially because I was like, oh dang, now this, our new hire thinks his new boss is an idiot, which was exactly, how I found myself in that spot in the first place.
Stop! I already am sold.
Exactly.
I mean, that's a perfect example. It's just that I think those are the types of moments that we just don't forget. They just stick with us.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Nice. Well, you may have already answered this because that's a pretty good one. One of my favorite questions to ask is like if there's a memorable deal that just sticks out that kind of makes you crack up. And so I think you may have already jumped the shark, but I'm curious. I'll throw it out there. There are some other examples where you just look back and you kind of laugh at either something that you learned was an outcome or a moment that you're just like, man, I'm so surprised I didn't see that one coming.
Yeah, but yeah, well, there are a lot of them. So another kind of memorable deal because it was like my screw up is I was talking with one of our champions who just had to let go a lot of their team, unfortunately, and she showed up to our call very emotional and talking about all of the work that now she had to backfill and get done, and she was like clearly very stressed. And so I went into problem solving mode. And I was like, okay, this is how, we're going to get these things done in this timeline so that you now have the support and so on. And like, I was like, in my mind, I was like, oh, you're being so helpful to somebody who is totally stressed out. And she stopped me and she's like, Nate, you don't get it. You're not hearing me right now. Like, there's all of this change happening and you're just talking to me about more change. And that was pretty much the end of the call. And I would say my inability to meet her where she was in that moment probably cost about 3 months of rebuilding some trust and delays within the cycle, because the fact was those layoffs created an even stronger case and need for our product.
Hmm.
But how I approached it delayed the process. And so what I took away from that is this reality of, we talk about the buyer's journey all the time, but we forget about the buyer's emotional journey,
Yeah.
and the fact that plays a significant role in how we all process, take in information, make decisions, and so on. And then the last one, this is kind of a favorite. It was right after, and I tell this like every like quarter end, the big like DocuSign slip up, where we had just signed a deal that one of our strategic reps had worked a long time on,
Hmm.
and she was stoked. A contact came into the end of the deal and like sped everything up, got it across the line. It was great. So it comes in when she's on a cruise. She's like 4 margaritas deep. She replies to the DocuSign email thinking that she's just writing to me, talking about like how this, new contact got everybody, everybody else who was just slow and like couldn't figure it out, right? Not realizing that the reply all function to the DocuSign email includes them on the thread. And so I read this, seeing that they're on the thread, and I'm like, oh my gosh, Rachel. Um, and and she didn't realize it until I wrote back, and I wrote something along the lines of like, yeah, it was so great how thoughtful and conscious they were, like in the decision process. Set us up for a great partnership, and it's so great to have like the fresh energy from this new. Like I was like all of the political ability within my brain, I like willed and put into this one email to like avoid starting that relationship off from a pretty rough, rough starting point. So I think about that one every like quarter end when DocuSigns are flying around.
Every time you hit that reply all button, that's just in the back of your mind, just to be really conscious. Yeah, that's a great
Exactly.
one. Well, I've got one more question for you before we get out of here, but I wanna let people know, like, where should they reach out to you? I think LinkedIn's an obvious answer, but who maybe like do you guys work with? Like, who does Fluent support?
Yeah. So LinkedIn, by the way, is a great place to find me. I think we're going to share one of the links to our blogs, where all my kind of long form writing is either is a great way to connect. And who we work with is B2B sales teams who are trying to figure out how do we sell with champions, set them up to control and influence our message when we can't be in the room with them. So if you are working on any type of complex deal, by the way, complex, like we have a lot of users who are doing 10, 15K deals, but they
Mhm.
sell to HR who have to get a bunch of people leaders involved. And to your point, everybody's got an opinion, everybody's got different incentives and metrics. And so that's a complex deal. If you're working on complex deals, multiple buying contacts who all have to make a decision, and you need your champions to sell you internally, that's the exact use case that Fluent solves for.
And Nate is very, very generous with providing like his content. Just following him will start to give you a great idea of how you can up level in this space. So I would recommend everybody go to LinkedIn and follow him if you're not already. Though I'm guessing a good amount of them already are. So
Well, thanks, man. I appreciate that.
I hope they are. So the question I want to get you out of here on is one that I like. It's a little lighter. It's like, if you were to recommend, and this is like bucket list type stuff, one artistic event, it can be sports, it can be music, it can be visual art, it can be going to, something in nature. What is something that you feel like folks should definitely experience, and why?
So front couple rows, like 1 through 5, at Red Rocks on like a cool fall evening, with one of your favorite bands playing, and that I think is just one of the best things. The sound, the sights. If you've never been or heard of Red Rocks, it's out here in Colorado where I live. It is an amphitheater that is basically carved into the mountainside, in a series of very large red sandstone rocks. And it's like nothing else. It's truly a pretty incredible experience.
That is awesome. Also, some of the artists that we've had recommended play at Red Rocks fairly frequently, so that is a great tie-in. It's if you haven't been, it's like a 9,500 person amphitheater. It's way steeper than you would expect. I think
Hmm.
the first time I went, I actually came in the back and the top, and I looked from the top down, and I was just like, "Whoa, you can ski down this!" And I think people do on occasion when there's enough.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when you come at night and you just see everything lit up against kind of the night sky with the stars. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and the sound is second to none. So my buddy Ian says hitting Red Rocks tonight for Nathaniel Ratcliffe. So there you go.
There you go. That's and a great concert. Fun fact: my full name is Nathaniel.
There you go. You heard it here first, folks. Well, Nate, Nathaniel, thank you so much for coming on My Best Sales Mistake. And folks, if you're not following him, go out there and get on it. Thanks, Nate.
Thanks for having me.